Shanti, 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 Shanti.
Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to Cosmic Convos. My name is Anya Light, your host. I am here today with a beautiful, beautiful human being. His name is Swami Padmanabha. He is a mentor of mine, a fellow companion on the Bhakti path of yoga. I'm so excited to have this conversation with him today about the topic of cultivating love. Thank you so much, Swami, for joining us today. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, before we dive into our dialogue, I would love to share a brief bio. At an early age, Swami Bhakti Pranaya Padmanabha delved deeply into the theology of diverse mystical traditions. After taking up Krishna Bhakti, he has dedicated himself to an extensive study of the Gaudiya Vedanta texts under the guidance of his devotional mentors. Fluent in English and Spanish, Swami has written hundreds of articles in both languages. For the past 20 years, he has traveled around the world and lectured in universities, ashrams, and yoga studios. Most of his numerous talks and seminars are available online. You can see them at his website, and I'll link it in the description box below. As a leader of spiritual retreats and communities, he inspires both practitioners and visitors with his penetrating teachings and personal examples, and I can attest to that. I was at a retreat with the Swami in July in Michigan, and I think I'm still integrating everything that was shared. In fact, I know I am still integrating that in September now. So, and one of the things we'll talk about today is his new book, Radical Personalism, Revival Manifesto for Proactive Devotion, which is one of the most compelling books that I have read in the past few years. This book for me was and is a game changer about how we can open up our hearts wider and wider into love, which is, in my opinion, the connecting force of all mystical and spiritual traditions. And so the Swami has this background in Hinduism, specifically in the Bhakti Krishna tradition. But today we're going to broaden that discussion and hopefully make this applicable to every spiritual seeker out there. And our Bhakti friends, hopefully, too, will enjoy this conversation as well. So thank you again for joining me today, Maharaj. I truly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. So this book that it is beautiful. And as I was mentioning before we got started with the recording, that it's so beautiful and dense and a lot to process and work through. And I really appreciate that because there's just a lot of layers. And I think the thing that for me weaved it all together is this love theme. Like, how do we love more deeply and profoundly as human beings? So Maharaj, would you open us up this dialogue here by sharing what is love and how do we embody love on this spiritual journey?
Well, that's a very big question, as simple as it sounds. And love, I would say, is one of the most used words in our vocabulary, as long as words like I, and probably some of them are the most misunderstood words as well, many times. Many times the words that we are used to invoke the most on a daily basis somehow get like normalized. While actually they should remain always extraordinary as they are, no? A word like love. So I appreciate your question because, again, we may use the word love, but each one of us may have a very different idea of that. Or we may have just one idea of that, while at the same time we can speak about different expressions of love, different nuances of love, different degrees, if you will, different depths. So I like always to preface any of my answers to these like crucial questions by making that clear. It's not a black and white thing. Okay, this is love. Official definition, next question.
Right.
There are so many levels and degrees. But what comes to mind, a definition from my own tradition in connection to Bhakti, which basically Bhakti is a way of talking about love, because ultimately Bhakti is love. And one of our mentors or teachers described Bhakti or Uttam Bhakti, the highest type of Bhakti or the highest type of love, which again may be the ideal expression for us, but from that ideal expression we can understand all the other expressions. So he describes that this love has to be ideally free from selfish motivations, free from selfish exploitation, free from wanting the other person basically to serve me in a separate way, but should be able to establish a common universal center that we all share in common, that all realities revolving around. So when we are able to establish that common magnetic center, so to say, we call it Krishna, which basically has to do with this principle of magnetism, all attractive. So it's the center that is attracting everything to it, and all is revolving around that. So this ideal of love has to be revolving around the principle which is universal, because if it's not universal, our so-called love will be just in one particular direction and having me probably as the center, and that instead of love will create so much conflict. So ideally, this definition of love has to do with this common center, in the center. I mean, it's always in the center, but acknowledging that center. And we offering our heart unconditionally with the favorable intention of give pleasure to the object of our affection, basically. You know? Having that particular intention, so to say. Because again, love expresses itself in the form of service, we will say in our tradition. If I love you, I will give myself to you unconditionally. So that's a kickstart to begin in this connection.
Yeah, for sure. I especially am gravitating and drawn to this concept of giving pleasure to another. And I think that that's really unique to the Bhakti tradition, because in many, for example, I was raised in the Christian tradition, and the idea isn't really there in the same way of giving pleasure, for example, to Jesus. Like, it's not a thing that we talk about. And in Buddhism, that's not. I'm also quite steeped in the Buddhist tradition as well, and that's not a dialogue that happens. So I think it's very interesting. And one of the draws that I have to the Krishna path, Krishna consciousness path, also known as Gaudiya Vaishnavism as well, is that we are offering our devotion, which is love, to Krishna, the specific being. And to me, that helps me to understand how better to love my fellow human beings, because this idea of giving Krishna pleasure, somehow in my doing of that, in my worship of him, in my praise of him, in my thinking of him, it like sort of molds me into it being able to then do that, offer that same mood to other humans. So do you have the same experience in your life?
Yeah. And I totally agree with your point, because of course, when I say giving Krishna, giving God pleasure, the idea of giving God pleasure doesn't exclude everyone else, because as I mentioned before, everyone else is revolving around this divine personality. And every time I say Krishna or God, again, I just mentioned this idea because sometimes I say the word God and some people may feel a little bit repelled by that. But generally, when that happens, we are being repelled by our own idea of what God means for us, which may be a not very attractive one. But again, for us, the notion of God or Krishna is the all-attractive one. You know, a personality who is not only attractive in terms of beauty and aesthetic sensibilities, but in terms of humility and compassion and selflessness and all the desirable attributes. So by nature, giving pleasure to him, since he's all attractive and since he's all generous and all humble, means whatever pleasure is given to him, naturally he extends that and distributes to others as well. He's not a selfish guy who receives our offering and takes all for him. Because again, everything is connected to him. Sometimes the example is given: if you water the root of a tree, naturally the water goes to every branch and every leaf. No, the root is not taking all for itself. Or if you put food in your stomach distributes to the whole of the rest of the body. So in the same way, our attempt to give pleasure to the divine is with the idea of everything else is in connection to him. So that to begin with, and also in connection, as you mentioned, that whenever we relate to other beings, we can perceive them as manifestations of the divine, in the sense that in our scriptures it is described how God is in each heart, basically. Every person is a temple of the divine, so we are to relate to them accordingly. Not only every person, but our tradition will say every atom hosts the divine. So you can imagine how we are expected to relate to everything, having that proper vision, so to say.
Love that. I just got this image of Krishna as the sun, and as we funnel our attention and love and devotion to the sun, then that sun shines out. So it's this like solar imagery that I'm having. Thank you so much for that. That's really beautiful. And also thank you for the reminder that Krishna is not excluded from other people, and other people are not separate from Krishna. And I think that is perhaps one of the things that I've struggled with as I've come deeper into the Bhakti path, is I think that it's a misconception that I hear a lot, unfortunately, which is that I will say to people like, my practice is to see Krishna behind the eyes of every human. And sometimes people will correct me and say, no, you've got it all wrong. Like, they're separate. And I'm like, no, they're not. And it's like, we get into this like philosophical debate about it. To me, that it feels uncomfortable to think of Krishna as separate from beings. And in fact, I think of, for example, Mother Teresa, and her saying that her goal of service in her life was to look for Jesus, look for Christ in every person. And that's what she was doing when she was serving the poor. She was serving Jesus. And so I think in our tradition, having that similar approach maybe isn't quite as normalized yet in our, do you think?
Yeah. When you mentioned Mother Teresa, that reminded me that she also even told her sisters that we are not expected, do not talk about Jesus to anyone. You have to embody Jesus. She didn't say we are not here to preach about Jesus. We are here to be Jesus in example. That's our message, so to say, which is the most powerful way, of course, of conveying the teaching. No, like Saint Francis is said to say something like that. He say, always preach the gospel, and whenever it's necessary, use words.
Right.
So go back to your point. Yeah, I agree that we need, in our community in particular, and I'm sure in others as well, but I'm talking about mine, and I mentioned that in my book, we need to, so to say, to normalize more this immanence of God, this presence. I mean, God is transcendent for us, but it's immanent as well. So we have this philosophy that in Sanskrit is called Ved Aved, which means everything is God and everything is not necessarily is God at the same time. Like we can say the ray of the sun is the sun, but also it's not the sun. No, it's the sun, but it's not the sun. The ray enters your room, the sun enters your room, but at the same time, the sun didn't enter your room fully, because if not, the room is over. So in the same way, we are God, in the sense that we are an energy of God, and we are inseparably connected to Him, and He's present everywhere. But at the same time, we are individuals, and God is an individual, and that difference, so-called difference, is the one that allows for a loving relationship. Because if we will be God in every sense of the term, there wouldn't be anyone else to relate to. If everything will be God in every sense of the term, which is not particularly our philosophy. So for us, we are different from God in the sense that each of us have individuality, but that individuality is not a problem. It's what facilitates the possibility of a loving interaction. But again, that difference shouldn't be overemphasized to the point of like, we are completely disconnected from the divine or something like that, because that can be problematic. And in our scriptures that's mentioned. That's generally the view of the beginner practitioner. Right? It's described in the scripture that the beginner practitioner will see God in the altar, in what we may call the deity form, in the altar. He will say, okay, God is here, but he cannot or she cannot see, feel God anywhere else, only in this altar, only my altar. Then the more advanced practitioner will see God in other persons, not only in one altar, in different altars, in a practitioner, in a follower of the tradition, in another person who doesn't follow. And the most advanced practitioner will see God everywhere. No? That person will say where God is not, basically. Instead of asking where is God, he will reply, where is he not?
Absolutely.
So there are degrees of vision and perception of the divine presence. So that's interesting how the different levels of advancement in our traditions have been described in terms of how much you are able to perceive the presence of the divine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We have some work to do as a community. But again, as a community, still there will be people of different levels. So
Yes.
there will be those who will totally agree of this connection with the divine, and those who are still like, no, God is somewhere else, above the clouds, far away from us, and we are here, which of course is a very problematic notion that creates a big gap between us and the divine, instead of feeling he's here and now, closer than ever.
I was having a really blessed conversation with a devotee a couple weeks ago where I was expressing some deep longing to go to Vrindavan, which is this blessed sacred site in India that's like the Mecca for, or the Holy Land for people in Krishna consciousness. And I was like, when am I going to go? I can't afford it right now. And blah, blah, blah. And he's like, calm down. You're going to be okay. He's like, here's the thing. He's like, just Vrindavan is right here and right now. Like, you don't have to go anywhere to go to the energy of Vrindavan's like right here. He's like, and yes, eventually you will get to the physical place on earth called Vrindavan when the stars align, and that will be blessed too. And then he even said too, like when you're in Vrindavan, it's a portal to these other heavenly realms that are not on earth. And so he was like talking about how kind of everything is connected and everything can be now and here. And also like we can be one place and it's like a portal to a different place as well. So if I'm sitting here, for example, in this apartment that I'm in, and I'm in the right mood with you, which I feel like I am actually, that I am in Vrindavan and I am in these beautiful realms with Krishna and the heavenly abodes. So yeah, so what you just said reminded me of that conversation and makes me feel hopeful that wherever we are, we can tune into different realities. And going back to your book, so one of the things that I loved about this book is talking about how individuality is not a problem. And like a certain amount of separation is not a problem because it facilitates bhakti, it facilitates emotion and cultivating love. So like, would you be willing to describe any relationships or interactions that you've had with people in your life, whether students of yours or friends or whomever, where you had like a moment where you felt that this can only be happening because we perceive ourselves as somewhat separate, that just came into like clarity for you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to begin with, I totally agree with the devotee word you were talking about Vrindavan. Just in case to give more reassurance, Vrindavan is this state of consciousness, we will say. So if you tune in to that state of consciousness, you are there whenever you go. And if you take the plane and physically land in the earthly Vrindavan, so to say, but your consciousness is in whatever, Ypsilanti or whatever, you are in Ypsilanti, you are not in Vrindavan. So again, it's a lot, and many of our teachers will recommend better you don't go to Vrindavan physically and try to remain there internally than go in there physically, but mentally being somewhere else. Something like that. No? Of course, one can go physically and be there internally. That's ideal also, but there are different ways to participate into these realms of consciousness. Again, there are dimensions of consciousness, of participation, internal participation. So, but I appreciate you brought that point, and basically the last chapter of my book is a big part about that, about how the spiritual world, as we call it, is a state of consciousness, not so much a 3D geographical location. And in connection to the question you mentioned regarding if I had the chance of having this experience of, well, whatever is happening, maybe happening in terms of a conflict or a difference of opinion, if I understood correctly, your question has more to do with this fact of perceiving ourselves separately. And yes, of course. I cannot even count how many times that happened to me in conversations, in relationships, in my daily dynamics as trying to guide some people or be guided by other people or be friends with other people. All my different relationships, this type of pattern has come in one form or another, in which in the two directions. Whenever there may be a conflict, on some degree, of course, not so intense, and realizing, yeah, this is coming because of we are out of center, basically. We are out of sync with our common ideal, with our common connection. We are interconnected forever. So we are why we are now treating each other as strangers. We have lost sight of our very nature. So this, of course, this situation invites us to reconnect, to reestablish our actual position. So that happened many times. And fortunately, we were able most of those times to recalibrate, so to say, like the GPS is saying, recalculate and go back to where we actually are, we belong. And also it happened not with conflict necessarily, but with beautiful moments of epiphany, of revelation, where me and other people could very deeply, beyond words, I couldn't put it in words, but very deeply experience how deeply interconnected we are, even with people that I just came to know 5 minutes before that. No, sometimes it doesn't necessarily happen with everyone that you have to know for minimum 3 decades, but just having some experience. Like sometimes recently I was in a retreat seminar, very interesting, of healing modalities, and they did an exercise that I myself did in the past and made other people do, which is simple, but it's very connected to this, which is just sitting with the other person and gazing at the other person, looking at each other at the eyes as deeply as you can, as openly as you can, with trust, with vulnerability, with well-wishing, with favorable energy toward the other person, and vice versa. And if both parties are really present there and open, it just takes seconds for you to have, let's call it, mystical experience. And that mystical experience, I will say, it has a lot to do with feeling, wow, despite so many daily obstacles that I myself put, so many distances and differences and conflict, if we just concentrate on who we actually are and our interconnectedness, that's so quickly the miracle happens, so to say. So that's a practical exercise that we are suggesting here publicly, in case you never did that for the audience.
I've done that I actually lead people in that a lot. One of my work things in the world is doing Reiki healing sessions. And sometimes people they'll come to me wanting healing, but they have these blocks or walls up. And so sometimes I'll just say, let's just sit and stare at each other for a while before we get deeper into it. And that just cuts through. So yeah, it's powerful. Maybe starting with your partner or your close friends is like an easy way to start. And then from there, maybe.
But it's incredible when you have, as I agree with your point. Okay, you can start with someone you know and you trust. If it sounds too risky doing it with someone else, but eventually it's incredible how you can, if you are trained a little bit into that openness, how you can have these similar epiphanies with anyone that you are just knowing for 5 seconds. So that that is showing how in potential we have the potential to connect and to relate from our interrelatedness immediately. And that's so healing. That's so so healing for so many of the problems and trauma and dysfunctionality that is pervading our modern society, and trying to be brought back to our common root, our common source, our common relatedness.
Yeah. Could we look at the question from the other angle of, do you sometimes, and maybe if you can think of a specific story, but if not, that's okay too, but maybe sharing about time or times where you were really grateful that there was, because your book is, so it's radical personalism. So the idea that you're exploring, I think, is celebration of the fact that we are individuals and we are unique as human beings. Like, we do perceive in so many ways that we are separate, but in the way I took the book was like, yay, like, oh, cool, as opposed to like, oh, darn, we're failing because we see ourselves as separate individuals. Because I think that, I mean, for me, in some of the other different yogic paths and traditions I have explored, it never fully gelled or resonated in the sense of, it felt like it was a lot of like bemoaning our separateness or our individuality, our unique qualities. It was like, we got to get rid of all that as soon as possible and like just jump to like the oneness. And it was like, wait, hold on a second, like slow down. Can we just like enjoy being human for 5 minutes? Because I don't know about you, but I've gone through a lot of suffering in my life. And now at the point I'm at now, there's a big desire in me to celebrate like all I've been through and to be like, yay, I'm a human and it's okay. So could you talk about maybe like some of that? Like, and did I accurately describe what you were trying to express in the book?
Yes, you are a good reader. Yeah, my book is a lot about celebration of our individuality, not to the point of individualism and to the point of like anthropocentrism, like we are the center of the universe and we are only the best, and I'm the better than anyone and I don't care for anything else, only humans and only me, and the individuals to the point of not considering anyone else, not in that sense, but to really celebrate the fact that we are different. But again, different doesn't mean separate, I will say. No, because sometimes we merge these two words. No, like we are separate, we want union. We don't want separatedness. So if difference is equated with separatedness, then we have to do away with difference. So everything becomes the same thing. And there are some paths that present that proposal. I'm not here to debunk them or criticize them. I'm just saying that in our particular tradition, as well as in many others, of course, differences are not necessarily a problem. Diversity is what allows, as I mentioned before, if there wouldn't be someone else, we couldn't ultimately have the experience of love, because love is an interaction. So if everything is one in every sense of the term, there's not someone else to interact lovingly with. So for us, diversity, of course, can be a problem, can be, shouldn't be, but can be. We have differences of opinion, and that creates conflicts, and that creates wars, and that creates so many type of things because of this sense of separatedness in every sense of the term. So I will say that for us, it's very important that first of all, we establish this unity in the sense of all of us are revolving around the common center, all of us are interrelated. So in that sense, we are one. And on the basis of that unity, there is diversity. But the diversity is not divorced from the unity. That's why we call it unity in diversity. So we are different, but that difference is different enough so we can both recognize our common source, and we can relate to each other accordingly. And that diversity facilitates so much experience. Like, as they say, variety is the spice of life. This is a common saying. Of course, if you put too much spice, the food is ruined. So if we put too much variety and diversity without proper underlying union, only diversity creates conflict, difference of opinion. But only unity, in my opinion, is a little boring in the sense that everything is one and there's no diversity, no individuality whatsoever. So personally, I'm more for the middle path between the two, not the extreme of conflict and diversity, not the extreme of unity, but an underlying unity on which basis diversity can be expressed. And yes, in that sense, life becomes a celebration, basically.
Ooh, I love that. That's
being an individual is not a problem. I mean, can be a problem if we don't know what to do with our individuality, but if we have the proper idea, that's a complete blessing.
Yeah. Wow. So coming back to the theme that I wanted to dive into together, and this is sort of like an ongoing learning for me. Sometimes I do these interviews with these beautiful beings such as yourself, and then I forget what the theme is because my mind is just like going down different paths. So I'm trying to come back to the cultivating love idea. So along with what you were saying, in our relationships, I think it can get confusing sometimes because we have this like grand, often many of us on the spiritual path, we have this like grand aim of unconditional love. Like, I want to love everyone unconditionally with my heart open and just be this like presence of love in the world. And that's our aim. And we don't want to exclude anyone from that. Even like, for example, the worst murderers in our mind, we don't want to harbor like anger and bitterness towards them because that just perpetuates the cycle of violence and such. So it's like we have this aim, like, I want to love everyone on this big, huge scale. That's our aim. But also, like, in the reality of human life, we have these individual relationships, and sometimes we might get confused about prioritizing or how to basically, like, as a human, we have limited time and ability. Like, there's only so many hours in a day. We have many different responsibilities. Maybe we have children and we have a partner and we have a spiritual teacher and we have clients or we have neighbors or whatever, different kinds of roles and different relationships. How do we prioritize, or how do we negotiate? Maybe that's a better word. How do we negotiate our different interactions? How do we flow love to people? How do we cultivate love in different relationships while keeping that idea of like the unity of like, we're trying to unconditionally love everybody. Like, that's our big goal. But then in the reality of our lives, like, we have decisions to make about how we use our time and energy. So any thoughts? Because I mean, you as a spiritual teacher, you travel the world. Like, I can only imagine how many messages on Facebook you get every day or how many emails, it's like, how do you balance all this stuff?
Well, too many of them, I have to tell them, give me a few weeks before I reply the message because I'm traveling, I'm a little busy to begin with. But yeah, something that comes to mind to begin with is this idea of, okay, for example, if you want peace in the world, the best thing you can do for that is to be at peace yourself. In the same idea of loving the whole world, but try to, first of all, be properly, because sometimes the idea of I want peace in the world can be an evasive device, so not to be at peace with myself, which is way more difficult. Okay, I have to work on myself, do the necessary things to be a unit of imbibed peace myself. Wherever I go, wherever I am emanating that. That's the actual reality. And so the same is with love. It's not that I have the time, as you mentioned, the energy to meet every single entity on the planet and express my love to them. I mean, it's not practical. It won't happen, which of course is not an excuse to not try to reach others with that love, but it's, as you mentioned, a limited amount of time. So the best thing that I can do to reach others on a universal level is try to imbibe that universal love myself, be a loving presence wherever I may be. And that in itself is creating a difference in the whole world, planet, universe, multiverse. As I always like to say, there are so many of these unknown, invisible saints, for example, that, to give an example, they may live in a cave or in a monastery or in a mountain. Nobody will know about them ever, but they are keeping the world the planet Earth in its orbit, so to say. No, the love that is coming from their prayers, their presence is blessing everyone, even though nobody knows about them. And that's really love. No, love doesn't mean, hey, I'm loving all of you, I want to be famous because of that. No. So also I'm saying that because sometimes we may say, I want to show unconditional love to everyone. And I appreciate this stance, so to say, but also we should be, because we are very expert of tricking ourselves in so many ways. And sometimes, as you mentioned, also the daily relationships we have. So we may say, I want to love everyone unconditionally, but sometimes we are mistreating our wife or our children at home or our husband. So begin at home instead of trying to love the whole world unconditionally, because if not, repeating that too much ends up being like a facade to cover the homework we have literally at home with our immediate relationship. So again, if we want to love unconditionally, let's begin at home. Let's begin with myself, with my immediate relationships. And then it will become evident, clear, how much we actually want to extend that universally. Because again, it's not so easy. It's easy to say it. No, it's easy to do the copy paste of the quote, but to live it on a daily basis, to walk the talk, that's challenging. It's beautiful, but it's challenging. So we need to be put to test so we can see where we are standing actually, and we don't deceive ourselves basically with something so high as unconditional love. We don't want to use the concept of unconditional love to deceive ourselves basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's something you discuss a lot in your book, which is let's not spiritually bypass and sort of use certain spiritual concepts or practices or aims to kind of like almost like leap out either too far or it's like making things so grand that then we're actually forgetting the micro healing moments, like you were just saying, like the starting at home. How are we treating our wife or our husband or children or neighbors? I mean, I'm thinking for me, I live in like an apartment that's in a house. So the house is divided into separate sections. And sometimes I think about how hypocritical I am. Like, for example, I go out and teach a class on love, you know, these highfalutin spiritual meditation techniques and etc. And then I come home and then I'm sort of annoyed at the lady who lives downstairs and like grumble about whatever she's doing, and maybe ignore her text messages or something because she's annoying me when I could be.
Hopefully she's not here in this interview now.
And if she does, that's great, because then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, so yeah, I appreciate
I agree. As simple as it sounds, we will be put to test in our relationships, I would say. I mean, it can be very dangerous to have all these spiritual ideas and concepts and absolute notions and very refined, high, deep theology, because we can really hide into them. We can really use all of them unconsciously, not without bad intention, but unconsciously use all these high ideas to cover up for our unaddressed issues and just talk about very unique, incredible thing, even become a very charismatic professional speaker about that, but then go to the day-to-day relationships and, as you mentioned, the micro moments. And I mean, the micro has to refer to the macro. Everything has to be interconnected. No? As the saying goes, how you do anything is how you do everything. No, it's not that I do this in this way, but I do this in the totally opposite way. That's strange. How you do anything, starting from the most ordinary moments of your life, is how you do everything. So, and that's challenging, I know. But if we are sincere and honest, we will want to go through that filter to see where I actually am. Because if I want to love unconditionally, I'm willing to learn all the ways that I'm not loving unconditionally, not as a torture, not to bring a whip and enter into a guilt trip, but just to be honest and sincere and authentic with where I actually am, so I don't deceive myself thinking I'm here, well, actually I'm here, and I will celebrate whatever I'm actually am, and from that trying to project a sustainable goal also, because also this idea of I want unconditional love, it's beautiful, but it's a very deep and high goal. So if we impose on ourselves a very high goal on short-term period, that can be a very discouraging, because it may not be easy to get there that quickly. So we should be also, how to say, intelligent in establishing short-term, middle-term, long-term goals in a way that we can pursue them in a happy, joyful, and sustainable way.
How do we, this is taking a little bit different direction, how do we sustain ourselves when perhaps we go through periods of our life where we're not, for whatever reason, able to be around as much or any perhaps spiritual community? Because for me, like, for example, I get together with devotees and we do kirtan and my heart blasts open and I'm in love with everybody in the room. Everybody is my lover. Everyone's Krishna. It's easy. It's like effortless. And maybe someone that was even slightly irritating me a few minutes before the kirtan now is like the most beautiful, radiant being in the world. So yeah, it's like community, these practices in our different traditions, like whether it's in the Christian tradition and we're singing these glorious hymns, or in Buddhism, we're chanting and we're in meditative silence, different traditions have different practices. You get together with community, like-minded souls, and then it's like easier to love. What do we do or what do you do if you ever experience times in your life where maybe community isn't as like readily available for whatever reason, like maybe other responsibilities are coming up for people, or whatever's going on, it's like you don't have as much of that boost from others? Do you have any advice for, like, just if you're alone by yourself and you're not feeling loving, maybe you're not feeling loving to yourself, what are some things that you do to get in that mood of love?
Well, of course, as important as it is, as our individual side is important as it is, and as it is important to have moments of retreat and solitude and introspection, of course, we cannot emphasize enough the importance of Sangha or community, as you mentioned. So my first thing I will say is, if for some reason one is not able to have that community experience, I will say, first of all, try to see if there is some arrangement you can do to have that community experience. Because sometimes we may be able to do some arrangement to have it on some level, no? On some level, whether online or whether traveling or somehow or other. And community, again, doesn't mean a massive gathering. It's just, as you mentioned, like-minded, kindred spirits, like-minded spirits. So that may be one more person. Like the Bible says, when 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am. And in our tradition, we have similar verses. So it can be one more person, and then you have community. Community means common unity. The word means that, common unity. So we are united with our common center. That's community. So I will say that to begin with, just not to make it too easy. Like, okay, if you don't have community, no, try to have it as much as you can, because that's very important. Proper community, again, not trying to create a social dynamics to hide ourselves in the masses, but intimate connection with like-minded souls. But if for whatever reason that's not possible on a daily basis, in my particular case, that's not so much the case. I'm really very blessed to, basically, whenever I'm traveling, I'm having connection with friends and like-minded spirits. So I'm really very grateful and blessed for that. But sometimes it can happen a few days in between. So personally, of course, I try to take connection with the sacred scriptures. For me, that's another way of experiencing community, because for us, those texts are not just mere books. They are living messages with living people inside of that. If you properly connect with sacred scripture, you will associate with those personalities. So you will be able to have what we call satsanga or sadhusanga, or communion with them. So that's another way of keeping the flow of sangha going. And of course, because your question was connected to the idea of love also, how to connect with that love if you are by yourself, if you feel like unplugged from that current, or not being able to experience that unconditional love toward others, toward yourself. So I always would like to say in that connection, as I mention in my book, a good place to start is to be reminded of God's unconditional love toward us. That's a very ideal kickstart for us. Now we are already being loved unconditionally from day zero, so to say, from time without beginning, by the divine. So we are already loved. So even if you don't love yourself, because many people really don't love themselves, unfortunately, and with this, I'm not saying in a narcissistic way, like I love me and I'm unique, but in a deep way, but really being grateful and appreciated ourselves, our existence. And that the fact that God is finding something lovable in us, and we need to learn that thing that he loves. So knowing ourselves to be loved, at least for me, especially in those moments where I need to reconnect with that principle of unconditional love, going to that foundation, I'm being loved unconditionally without doing any merit for that. It's just coming unconditionally. That's the very meaning of the word. That's so moving. That's so inspiring, so empowering for me to try to do something with that unconditional love that I received, and trying to extend that in other directions. So for me, that's a very powerful meditation, basically. I'm trying to get back to the idea of God's love, loving us unconditionally, and realizing how when we forget that, we so easily fall into this self-deprecation and self-loathing and guilt, excessive guilt, and basically unlovingness toward ourselves, and by extension probably toward everyone else. Because if you don't learn to love yourself in a healthy way, you won't be able to extend that to anyone else. So I will say it all begins by acknowledging how we are already loved by God. So that's the self-esteem we need, so to say. Again, self-esteem doesn't mean I'm incredible, better than anyone else. No, self-esteem is, wow, my own self is already loved unconditionally by the most important person. Wow, that's moving. That's incredible. That's humbling. That's inspiring. So I have to do something with that now.
Yeah, and I think that perhaps this is still something that spiritual practitioners across the world are trying to come to grips with, and like update the old paradigms of this idea that like, well, self-love just leads to narcissism, like I think that's still pretty prevalent, unfortunately, in a lot of spiritual communities. And so that's what I love about your work so much, is you bring that attention to self-love as being a very nurturing, nourishing, like part of the equation that we can't like separate out. Like it's like you just said, we have to love ourselves. If we're not feeling love for ourselves, and we're not open to the divine loving us unconditionally and feeling that, then how in the world are we gonna, like in our interactions and relationships, how are we gonna flow love to them? It's impossible. So
yeah, and again, self-love is not narcissistic, because the self doesn't exist independent from God and everything else. So it will be narcissistic if we love ourselves, considering ourselves unique and completely isolated from the environment. But the fact that we are undeniably connected with God, loving ourselves means loving ourselves in connection with God. And in connection with God means in connection with the unconditional love he already has for us. So that's a real picture of self-love. No, it's not just I'm loving myself as a separated, isolated unit, and I'm just like putting myself on a pedestal of ego, and I love me and I love me.
yeah.
But self-love implies actually realizing what's the self and what's the nature of the self as interrelated with the divine and with everything else. In that context, loving all that we are in connection with everything else, because again, we are not separated beings. So in that case, self-love will be, again, humbling, inspiring, moving. It won't be a symptom of arrogance or things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a quote from your book that I wanted to share. If I can find it. Oh, yeah. So one of the things about self-love, the self-love journey, and again, this is perhaps an area that different spiritual traditions can actively work on upgrading to new insights, is loving the body. And, this is, my gosh, this is probably the biggest one, the biggest sort of thing I think that spiritual traditions are upgrading right now in terms of love. So, in maybe older ways of thinking about things, and not necessarily wrong, but perhaps at least the way that we seem to see things, it's limiting and perhaps even harmful to look at the body, the physical form, the physical manifestation as, lower or always sinful, or just inherently bad or wrong or flawed. And in your book, a beautiful passage that I'd like to read here, you say, although we are not the physical psychic body, this doesn't mean we shouldn't take care of it and learn to properly integrate the bodily dimension into all the other layers of being. A tall and expansive tree can only be such by its deeply rooted grounding. And I just love that, because it gives me permission to love this too. Like, I love Krishna, I love you, I love the people outside that are, I don't know if you could hear it, but they're making loud sounds outside. So I'm sending them love. Because I'm like,
that's not the neighbor from the floor below.
that's different. They're like people cutting down trees, actually. And they started like this morning, and I was like, oh, because I was trying to find different places to record this in my home, and every place it was just as loud. And I was like, well, there's no solution to this other than send them love. So I don't know if have you heard it? It's been in the
No, I'm not hearing, but
oh, good. Well,
for some reason they are coming today that we are talking about unconditional love. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, so I lost my train of thought with that.
you were talking about loving. If you can love God, you can love this body, the neighbors, everything.
Yeah. So could you share a few words? And we're starting to move towards wrapping up our conversation. I feel like maybe just one or two more questions after this, but could you share a little bit about loving the body? And your experience particularly is interesting as a monastic. Like, there's this, I think, long held belief that once you're a monastic, you should just transcend the body and, all this stuff. So, any thoughts to share on the value and importance of love in connection with the body?
Yeah. Well, yeah, to begin with, as a monastic, I accept that there is sometimes this idea that being a monk means to reject basically stuff, and that's understood. Transcendence sometimes is understood as rejection, but actually transcendence has to do with integration. And we don't need to reject anything, because everything is an energy of the divine, and therefore everything is potentially sacred. I mean, everything is sacred and has the potential. We have the potential to acknowledge that sacredness and engage and connect with everything, matter included, this body, a sacred paraphernalia, as I like to call it, in the service, to be engaged in the service of the divine. So actually, real monasticism doesn't have to do with rejecting things, considering the world is bad. As you mentioned, the body is inherently profane. All those things are in our own filter and lens and projection toward the environment. If we feel this is profane, the profanity is in our own minds, basically, in our own lens. And we have to take responsibility for that, instead of projecting the profanity outside of us. Of course, that's comfortable in one sense. That becomes very uncomfortable then. But so the important thing for me is, transcendence has to do with integration, not with rejection. From the ideal perspective, there is nothing needs to be rejected. Only the wrong vision of things needs to be rejected. So the body is, again, sacred. It's an energy of the divine. As I mentioned before, for us, God inhabits each atom. So you can imagine, you can meditate on your body as as being all pervaded in every atom by the omnipresence of the divine. So how can you think of rejecting that? And you will be rejecting the divine himself in one sense. So there is place for loving the body. And again, loving the body doesn't mean indulging in narcissistic, hedonistic lifestyles, as a monk especially. No, it doesn't have to do that. It has to do with honoring this particular energy called matter, whether it's physical matter, whether it is psychic matter, what we may call mind, intellect, ego, and so on. So loving the body basically means, first of all, acknowledging the body for what it is. I will say that's the first step in loving. Like, if I love you, I will acknowledge you for who you are. That's the first step. Like, I will show you my respect and my consideration of who you are by allowing you to be who you are, not just imposing my own idea of who I think you are. That's not very loving. So first way of showing love to our bodies, understanding what my body is, what matter is, connecting this energy with its source. That's very loving. And on that basis, of course, you will relate to this body accordingly. You will take care of the body in all the forms that the body needs to be taken care of. You will honor this particular vehicle that it has been given to you, to us, as something sacred. And there's no need to reject anything, basically. Again, there is a need to praise everything and to celebrate everything. That's the actual need. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
I mean, I'm summarizing chapters and chapters from my book. It's not so easy.
Yeah, I know.
There's so much more to say about that, but anyhow.
Yeah, I think that's a whole topic in itself we could talk about for weeks and weeks. Yeah. So I sense that we're winding down, and I'm wondering if perhaps from here, I know we had talked pre-recording of actually starting the conversation with a bit of Sanskrit healing, and I forgot about it, but that's blessed because it wasn't supposed to happen in the way I thought. So I'm curious, would you be willing to share as a kind of concluding healing moment, something that we both, I think, appreciate is the vibrations of Sanskrit to open the heart and cleanse the being. And so I'm wondering if you'd be able to share a prayer or a chant, or even read some sacred scripture in Sanskrit or something in Sanskrit, because that is just such a potent gateway to love, and perhaps using this as a guided meditation. So would you be willing to share something?
Yes. So, well, we can share one Sanskrit shloka or verse, which is dedicated to one form of the divine in our tradition, who is called the Golden Divine Lord. And he is said to come to this world repeatedly to share unconditional love in the most undiscriminate way, without making any discrimination, just giving the highest thing to everyone unconditionally. So it's a verse in which this fact is acknowledged, this fact is celebrated, and there is a prayer at the end of that this verse where the author is saying, well, may that golden lion, he says, roar in the innermost chamber of my heart. No? So I'll recite the Sanskrit. I just gave a brief meaning explanation of the Sanskrit. So the verse says like this. Anare pita chirim chirat karunaya vatirna kaloham samarpayitum unnatoj balarasam svabhakti shriyam Hari Purata Sundara Dyuti Kadamba Sandipita Sada Hridaye Kandhare Spurato Vasachinandana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel that Sanskrit connects us all because in some other incarnation, some other lifetime, past life, whatever you want to call it, like we have had an exposure to Sanskrit. And I feel that if we listen to it and just drop the expectation that we should feel a particular way, but just open to it, I feel it has a tremendous power to just automatically open the heart. That's what yeah.
You are totally correct. And I appreciate your point of opening ourselves without expectation, without trying to control the experience, and remaining open to the unknown, so to say, whatever needs to be unpredictably revealed. That's the very essence of faith and trust, into the journey. To remain open to that sacred visit, so to say, that goes beyond our control, but controls everything by this strength of love and affection. Yeah.
Swami, do you have any final thoughts to share on the topic of love, cultivating love, anything that feels important to conclude with?
Well, love feels important. Love itself feels important, and just the final thoughts that come to my mind is just, please, a message to the audience and a message to myself to begin with, and to everyone else. Let's not forget the priority. Let's not forget how much of a priority love still is in our daily life, still is for our family, still is for our community, for our world, for our planet. And let's not normalize the word love to the point that it becomes basically meaning and without much impact in our daily life. But let's keep this idea of love, as we have tried to discuss today a bit, where it belongs to, what it has to be, as a topmost priority that will put in context the whole rest of our existence, if we live our day-to-day accordingly, putting it into the not only top 5 list, but into the top 1 post of our existence. And after that, let's be open to witness the miracle of how everything unfolds into place because of being connected with this root, that is love, basically.
Yay. Yeah. Thank you. May we continue to share love, and I hope that all the beings that get the pleasure and joy of communing with you as you continue your tour right now, you're touring the world, you're in Sweden right now, and where are you going next?
I'm going to France on Thursday. Yeah, France, then Switzerland, then England, then India, New Zealand, and so on and so forth.
Amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
And you're based in South America, correct? When you're not traveling.
I'm not based anywhere, but somehow, in the sense that I'm traveling quite a lot these last years. But I will say that the place I stayed the most during the last years have been North Carolina in the US. And I have been spending a few months per year there. And Argentina, which is the place I was born, I generally spend some few months and live the majority of my life there. But the last 2-3 years, it has been quite dynamic in terms of traveling. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll put a link to your YouTube channel and your website, and a link to your book as well. And hopefully people will reach out if they feel inspired and connect with you more and share some love with you. So yes, thank you so much for joining the conversation today. And I'm just sending out love to all the viewers today, and hopefully your heart was touched in some way by this conversation about love. And please do leave us some comments below if you'd like to share about your experiences on the spiritual path with love. What practices, tools do you have? What spiritual tradition are you from? And how do you connect with love? We would definitely like to hear your thoughts on that. So, all right, Swami, it's been an honor and a blessing. And I feel sad that this conversation is drawing to a close, because I feel like I could talk to you forever, but we'll, for now, at least put a pause on this and wish everyone well. So thank you again.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Shanti, 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 Shanti.